Back in their prison cell, inside Mount Caldera, this time with Whammon as well, Thaddeus and Charlotte were watching the Silver Skulls in the light of the torches. They were bowing down in front of the altar, chanting mechanically. "I hope Chowker's found the children," said Thaddeus despondently. Just then, the bars of their prison door crashed open, and a group of jaguar heads loomed in. They dragged Whammon out into the temple, shutting Thaddeus and Charlie inside again as they left. They watched through the bars, horrified, as Whammon was prepared for sacrifice in front of the altar. A jaguar head was painting Whammon's face with strange symbols in red and white. Suddenly, there was a commotion outside their prison bars, and 2 jaguar heads barged into the cell, shoving Thaddeus and Charlie to their knees. The High Priestess entered. She signaled imperiously to her jaguar heads to leave. As soon as they had gone, she removed her mask. "Relax," she told them. "I hope you don't mind me popping in like this." Thaddeus and Charlie got up stiffly from the floor, looking with dislike at the strange woman in front of them. "Oh, not at all," replied Thaddeus dryly. This woman really did take the biscuit, he thought to himself. What on earth was she playing at? "The fact is," she went on, "I get rather starved of conversation. The natives are people of few words. It's one of the biggest drawbacks in working here." "So why are you here, then, of all places?" asked Thaddeus. "Money," she said in a matter-of-fact tone. "This part of the world is a virtual gold mine." So that was it, thought Thaddeus. You eliminated the trackers. Thaddeus remembered what Chowker had told the children about his tribe being killed by evil spirits. "There was no alternative," she sniffed dismissively. "You're the evil spirit of the mountain." Charlie was horrified. "Oh dear, shocked are we?" the High Priestess said mockingly. "What a pity. I did hope that we might be compatible. You're the first white people I've seen in 12 years. Out of curiosity, what were you doing here?" Without thinking, Thaddeus said, "We were taking the kids to see the statue." "Kids, did you say?" Thaddeus's face fell. How could he have been so stupid as to tell her about the children? "The Silver Skulls didn't find any kids on their search. How very useful this is for us." The High Priestess smiled a horrible smile. "I'll send out a scouting party right away." We sent them off to join another group," added Thaddeus. "Nice try," said the High Priestess. "But lying is not your forte. Fear not, we'll find them." She donned her hideous mask and swept out of the prison cell, leaving Charlie and Thaddeus looking devastated behind her. Down the mountainside, Oliver had just finished pulling the Land Rover out of the river and was rewinding his winch cable. "Right, that's it," he said to Ruby. "It's fairly easy from here back to my place. You ready?" "Just get me out of here," cried Ruby. She couldn't believe she was finally going back to some civilization. Chowker and Jack had returned and had relit the fire. Chowker had placed a small bowl on it with a blue freshwater mussel simmering inside. Mike and Laura, with the cockatoo on Laura's shoulders, were sitting close by. "I hope he knows what he's doing," said Mike quietly. "He does," said Laura confidently. Chowker poked at the shellfish inside with a stick. "How do you know when it's ready?" Jack asked. "Water goes blue," said Chowker. After a few moments, Chowker said, "Now!" With 2 sticks, he lifted the bowl and emptied the water onto the ground. Then he quickly scraped the shellfish from the steaming puddle and went over to Peggy. "Her mouth," he said to Laura. "Open." Laura leant over her sister, gently easing open her mouth. Chowker carefully levered the wavy edges of the shell open above Peggy's face. A trickle of blue liquid splashed into her mouth. When all the liquid from inside the shell had been given to Peggy, he stood up. "Now we wait," he said solemnly. The children looked at each other in silence. What if the medicine didn't work? What would they do then? In Oliver West's hut, Ruby gazed out of the window. "Where can they be?" she asked. "Don't worry," said Oliver, sensing she was worried. "If they're not here by dawn, we'll go and look for them, right?" Ruby nodded, relieved. "I can just see the headlines. 'Famous explorer rescued by the maniac,'" said Oliver. "Maniac?" Ruby looked puzzled. Oliver smiled, then he got up and walked over to a newspaper cutting pinned on the wall. It read, "The maniac crashes." Ruby read out loud. "Daredevil stunt pilot Oliver West survived a horrifying crash yesterday before a large crowd of people." "You were a stunt pilot?" she asked him. Oliver nodded. "Still, that's all over now. I haven't flown since the crash." "Why not?" said Ruby. Oliver held out his hands. They were trembling. "See that? If I even think about flying, this is what happens." "I know the feeling," said Ruby. Prince barked loudly. "So does he," she said. It was clear that nothing would get the three of them up in a plane again. At the children's campfire, a weak voice said, "Dad?" "Peggy?" cried Laura, waking up from where she'd been dozing beside her sister. "She's all right," breathed Jack, relief flooding through him. "Of course I'm all right," said Peggy indignantly. "Is there anything to eat?" "Typical," Mike laughed. Laura turned to Chowker. "Thank you, Chowker." And Chowker smiled. Inside the mountain, Thaddeus and Charlotte had been bound to stone pillars and could sense that something was about to happen. Light from the full moon neared the center of the round window, and steam rose from the well in the middle of the temple. As the moon appeared in the center of the window, the cage in which Huaman had been placed was hauled high into the air. The Silver Skull's chanting became more frantic. Very slowly, the Silver Skull started to lower the cage again, this time over the well. The steam hissed and curled about it as it moved. By the altar, the High Priestess began to speak, her voice deep and muffled through the horrible mask. "O sacred goddess of the sky, protect us against our enemies and bring evil to those who bring evil to your chosen people. We cry to you, O mighty one!" As Huaman was lowered down into the jet of steam, his body became a ghost-like figure in the grey vapour. The Silver Skulls danced with delight. The High Priestess moved nearer to Thaddeus and Charlotte. "A geological steam vent," she said smugly, smiling at their fear. "It's barbaric," gasped Charlie. "I suppose so," carried on the High Priestess. "Each month, over these 2 nights, they sacrifice to the moon. If they don't, they believe the moon will die. So, in order to prevent that happening, you will both sink into that vent tomorrow night." So saying, the High Priestess let out a braying laugh that echoed terrifyingly around the chamber. Out on the mountainside, Silver Skulls, following the orders of their High Priest, were moving stealthily through the trees. Unaware, the children and Chowker were sitting round their fire, wondering where their father and Charlie could be. Peggy looked at the flower that Chowker had given her, which she'd pressed between the pages of her diary. "Did you know there's a total eclipse of the moon tomorrow night?" she said, idly. Jack wasn't listening. "I could stay here forever," he murmured. "I couldn't," said Laura. "I want to find Dad and Charlotte. Then I just want to go home." "Me too," said Mike. Above them, the Silver Skulls were looking down on their camp, the light of the fire reflected in their horrible eyes. "What do you want, Chowker?" asked Jack. "Drive evil spirits away from my land," he whispered, looking up at the mountain. Suddenly, the Silver Skulls struck. They whipped out of the darkness like ghastly ghosts, gathered up the children who screamed and struggled in vain. The cockatoos screeched a horrible cry as they were dragged off into the darkness. The bird woman listened and watched, a silent feathered figure in the darkness. The Silver Skulls dragged the protesting children and Chowker to the rock face with the stone doorway. There, one of them pulled aside the stone which caused the rock to grind open, revealing the dark chasm inside. Bruised and shaky, the children were led roughly along the rocky tunnel and into the temple. Here, they were pushed into a small prison cell. The cockatoo perched nearby, out of sight. It had flown into the tunnel behind them. Inside Oliver West's hut, Ruby was asleep on the sofa. Through her dreams, she heard the sound of Prince's barking. "Prince, what is it?" she said as she came out of the hut, wondering what on earth Prince was playing at. Outside, the dog was pulling on an old tarpaulin with his teeth, tugging violently at the corner. Suddenly, it fell to the ground, revealing a brightly painted helicopter with a face painted on it. "Oh, my goodness," breathed Ruby. Oliver appeared in the doorway of the hut. "Is that yours?" Ruby called to him. "Yeah," he said, nodding. "Can you fly it?" she said. "I told you," said Oliver gruffly. "I haven't flown for years, not since the—" He found it difficult even to say the word crash. Prince barked at both of them, then hopped up into the open cockpit of the helicopter. "I'm not going to fly it," said Oliver. And he and Ruby looked at each other and nodded in agreement. Inside their prison cell, Thaddeus and Charlotte were beginning to feel utterly hopeless. Suddenly, they heard a commotion outside. Looking through the bars, they saw the children being hustled roughly out of their cell by the jaguar heads. "Charlie, they've got the children," said Thaddeus, gripping the bars. "I'm such a fool," he choked, turning to Charlie. "A stupid fool. Why didn't I keep my mouth shut?" "Stop blaming yourself," said Charlie, putting her hand on Thaddeus's shoulder. "I've got to get out of here," Thaddeus said hoarsely. "I've got to save the children." The helicopter stood on the ground, a silent reminder to Oliver that he should perhaps be doing something to help those people who might be in trouble somewhere in the jungle. Ruby stood with Prince by the Land Rover, watching Oliver as he paced round his helicopter, checking it over for flying. Her own fear of flying was worse than Oliver's. Prince barked, looking up at her. "Read my lips," said Ruby under her breath. "I am not going in a helicopter. Got it?" Prince barked again. Then he headed for the helicopter. A circle of light from the full moon shone in the center of the temple where the Silver Skull's chanting still continued rhythmically. The children were dragged into the sacred area by the jaguar heads and tied up to the pillars. Suddenly, the white cockatoo appeared from nowhere and landed on Laura's shoulder. "Oh, it's Snowy!" she gasped. "Where are we, Snowy?" "Skulls!" growled Chowker. "Chowker?" Peggy turned to him for an explanation. "Bad men!" he said fiercely. Laura had turned very white. "I feel funny," she said faintly. Peggy turned to Laura at her side. She was staring fixedly at the goddess, who was standing by a second altar. Suddenly, Snowy flew straight past the goddess. At the same time, a jaguar head untied Laura and led her away towards the goddess. "Well, it would seem that the new goddess has elected herself," the high priestess intoned. The goddess stood up. Laura walked up to her and embraced her. The high priestess turned towards the other children who were staring at their sister, horrified. "Put them in the temple," she ordered the jaguar heads. The children and Chowker were untied and led away. Laura had removed the mask from the goddess, and they were gazing intently at each other. "Alia!" Chowker suddenly shouted. "It is Alia!" The high priestess moved towards Laura and the goddess. She took the sacred mask from a jaguar head and placed it over Laura's face. Then she put a long, flowing robe over Laura's head and guided her towards a stone seat where the Silver Skulls gathered round her. The other goddess was led over to where the other children were. The Silver Skulls bowed repeatedly in front of Laura, their chanting rising and falling in an hypnotic rhythm, the high priestess beside them. To Thaddeus and Charlotte, watching from their cell, it was a nightmare. "What are they doing with Laura?" whispered Charlie. "Treating her as if she were sacred," realized Thaddeus in horror. The children and Chowker gathered round the native girl, Ayala. The cockatoo was perched on Peggy's shoulder. "Silver Skulls, take her," Chowker explained. "Made Ayala goddess, but she too old now." "Hello, Ayala," said Peggy, and they all smiled at each other. Then they looked down into the temple below, where the high priestess had turned towards the round window, looking at the moon. "The Sacred One has given us a new goddess," her voice echoed. "Tonight she will be crowned in glory. All praise the Sacred One." The Silver Skulls' chanting was reaching fever pitch. "We've got to get out of here," Peggy whispered fiercely. "And rescue Laura," said Mike. "But how do we get past the guards?" Jack was always the practical one. "There must be a way. Otherwise, how did the High Priestess get in?" "You're right. She came in from over there," said Jack, and he pointed at the throne where Ayala was sitting. Suddenly, the cockatoo flew across and landed on a piece of raised carving next to one of the panels in the back wall behind the throne. He pecked at a symbol in the center of the panel. Jack pushed it, and the panel silently slid up and a large opening was revealed. He pressed the carved symbol again, and the secret door closed. "Now for a plan," Jack thought. Charlotte was at the door of their cell, groaning dramatically as if she was in distress. "Somebody please help me!" A jaguar head strode over to their cell. He peered through the bars and saw Charlie writhing on the floor. He grunted, then opened the cell door. Just as he came in, Thaddeus, who had been hiding behind the door, slammed it hard against the jaguar head, who sprawled to the ground. "Come on!" yelled Thaddeus to Charlie. Quickly, they rushed out of the cell, pulling the door shut and bolting it again behind them. Then they made a dash for it down the steps towards the temple and Laura. No sooner had they run into the sacred area than Charlie was grabbed by the Silver Skulls. Thaddeus went back to try and help. "Let go of her, you skullhead!" he cried. Up the steps in the temple, the children heard the commotion down below them, and they crowded together to see what was going on. "It's Dad!" cried Mike. "And Charlie!" "They've caught them as well," Jack said despondently. "What are they going to do to them?" asked Mike. "I don't know," said Jack, worried, "but it doesn't look good." "I don't like this." Mike looked scared. "It's okay, Mike." Peggy tried her best to soothe him, "but we've got to think of a way of getting everyone out of here." As the children watched, Thaddeus and Charlotte were dragged across to the columns and tied up. Then the High Priestess, carrying bowls of pigment, came solemnly towards them. She nodded to one of the jaguar heads, who began to put sacrificial markings on Charlotte's face. The children watched anxiously from behind the temple seat. "What are they doing to them?" Mike whispered. "Ayala say, sacrifice," said Chowker. Peggy felt numb. "Sacrifice?" "Silver Skull sacrifice to keep tribe strong," Chowker said. "When moon is high, when it shine through ring, sacrifice to goddess." "You say when the moon is high?" asked Peggy. "Yes," Chowker nodded. "The moon," said Peggy quickly, "it shines through that ring thing over there, then they make their sacrifice?" He nodded. Peggy had a determined look on her face. "There's a total eclipse of the moon tonight." As one, they turned and looked at the moon shining through the round window. Then they looked down at Thaddeus and Charlie again. Their faces were now covered in painted symbols, and they were strapped to the altar. Thaddeus was looking at Laura intently. "She hasn't moved for ages," he whispered. "Maybe they've hypnotized her," said Charlie. "She's certainly in some kind of trance," admitted Thaddeus. "Do you think we'll be all right then?" Charlie asked him. Not looking too good, is it? He said. "I love you," said Charlie suddenly. "I love you too," said Thaddeus, trying to smile. "I can't believe it's got to end here." Charlie's face was breaking his heart. "I can't even kiss you," he said. "You could close your eyes and pretend," she whispered. In the temple, the children stood close together. Peggy said, "When you three go down the secret tunnel, Ayala and I will start a diversion." "But not until the moon reaches its zenith," affirmed Jack. Mike looked at his watch. "Not long to go now," he said. The High Priestess walked solemnly towards the altar. "The time has come," she intoned. Thaddeus and Charlotte were hurried towards the sacred cage by the jaguar heads. Almost as soon as they were pushed inside, the cage began to rise upwards until it was suspended high in the air over the well, the steam hissing out from the vent and shrouding them both. The Silver Skulls formed a circle round the cage, chanting and dancing, as Laura sat, unmoving, framed by the circle of flaming torches, looking distant and implacable behind her mask. The moon cast its beams spookily onto the middle of the floor. The High Priestess began the ritual. "The time of the new goddess!" In the temple, Peggy turned to Ayala. "We'd better get started," she said, and they disappeared behind the altar. The cage swung higher, carrying its sacrificial victims to the rocky ceiling. Underneath, the Silver Skulls swayed and chanted. Behind the altar, Ayala placed her robe over Peggy's head, and at the back of the temple, Mike, Jack, and Chowker stood by the secret entrance. Jack pressed the carved symbol, and the panel slid open. Suddenly, the white cockatoo flew into the mouth of the entrance. Jack slipped through the open panel doorway and started down a ladder which was suspended inside. Behind the altar, Peggy felt very nervous as she felt the mask going over her head and covering her face. "Please let them believe I'm a goddess," she whispered to herself. Ahead of the boys, the cockatoo fluttered backwards and forwards in the tunnel, trying to tell them something. "Chowker! Mike! This way!" Jack said, pointing at the bird. "He's guiding us!" The boys turned down the tunnel, following the white cockatoo flying ahead of them until they reached the end. Cautiously, they crept out into the temple near the pillars. Jack glanced round towards the round window carved out of the rock face. "I hope the eclipse is on time," he said. The moon slid slowly towards the center of the opening, casting its beams on the rocky floor and creeping towards the goddess, Laura. As the moon started to fill the window, the High Priestess cast herself full length on the floor in front of Laura. The acolytes did likewise. A shaft of moonlight crept slowly towards Laura as the cage creaked closer to the well. Suddenly, a high-pitched keening began from the temple. Peggy, dressed as Ayala, came to the edge of the temple steps and started to walk down them. While Ayala kept on keening, Peggy reached the foot of the steps and walked towards the round window. The High Priestess screamed, "Stop her!" The Silver Skulls and Jaguar Heads watched, transfixed, but nobody moved. Framed in the hoop of the round rocky window, Peggy raised her arms to the moon as it finally filled the space, then turned and called out, "The goddess eats the moon!" Just in time, a tiny piece of moon began to disappear, as if it had been bitten from the rim. The Silver Skulls and Jaguar Heads lay prone on the floor, too frightened to move, convinced that the end of the world was about to happen. Ayala kept up her wailing. The boys headed towards the well, seized the ropes which tethered the cage, and began to lower it to the ground. They worked quickly, releasing Thaddeus and Charlotte from the cage. "Good lads!" gasped Thaddeus. "You get the girls and head for the tunnel. We'll get Laura." As the boys ran towards Peggy, Chowker gestured to Ayala to come with them. Thaddeus and Charlotte moved swiftly across to Laura. "Laura, it's me, Dad," said Thaddeus, shaking her slightly. "We've got to get out of here." Laura seemed to shift restlessly and shook her head from side to side. "I have to stay," she wailed. Then she ran straight past them and into the High Priestess's arms. "She's mine!" said the High Priestess triumphantly. "Let her go!" shouted Thaddeus. "Please, I'll take her place if you like. I'll stay. I'll be your hostage." But the High Priestess was unmoved. "No, I'll keep her!" she cried. Charlotte had crept unnoticed behind the High Priestess. She raised her clenched fists above her head and hit the High Priestess with all her might on the back of the neck, knocking her over. Instantly, Thaddeus grabbed Laura and followed Charlotte as she led the way out. The High Priestess sprawled on the ground, her hideous mask knocked off her head. She suddenly looked pathetic and powerless. Jack, Mike and Peggy, with Chowker and Ayla, were waiting at the mouth of the tunnel, as Charlotte and Thaddeus, carrying the struggling Laura, ran towards them. "Chowker, grab a torch!" Thaddeus called. "Hurry!" And they sped on again, Chowker running ahead with a flaming torch into the tunnel. Inside the temple, the moon began to reappear from the shadow of the earth once more. The Silver Skulls and Jaguar Heads slowly raised their heads with cries of relief. The High Priestess ran among them, ranting and raving. "Get them!" she screamed. "Go on! Don't just stand there staring!" Suddenly, she realized she had forgotten to put on her mask. As she stood there, revealed as a small, mousy-looking woman, the Silver Skulls moved towards her. She started to back away towards the well. "Stop!" she yelled. "I can explain!" But the Silver Skulls took no notice as they moved relentlessly nearer and nearer. In the tunnel, the torchlight flickered on the rocky walls as the children and Thaddeus and Charlotte made their way, stumbling and breathing hard. The faithful Cockatoo flew ahead of them to the rock door where they had got in. "How do we get out?" Jack called back to the others. "There must be a way. Look for a lever or something," said Thaddeus. Jack fumbled with his fingers on the rock face, scratching his knuckles. "I can't see anything," he called. Suddenly, the Cockatoo flew along the rocky face of the tunnel wall, his wingtips scraping its surface. He landed to one side, and the others peered into the darkness. They could just make out a row of carved square pegs on a ledge, with symbols on them. Thaddeus walked over to them. He pulled one at random, and a low rumble could be heard behind them. They all turned round. A different opening in another part of the tunnel had appeared. Chowker ran to the opening and disappeared through it. "Chowker!" called Peggy, and she ran after him. "Come back!" shouted Thaddeus. "You're heading deeper into the mountain!" But Peggy was determined to follow Chowker. Suddenly, ahead of them, they saw men working with pickaxes and shovels. This was a mine. "Whaman!" shouted Chowker. He had seen his uncle. Whaman turned. "Masuri!" he shouted back. Then the door in the tunnel closed behind them. Thaddeus pulled each of the carved symbols in turn, desperate to open the door out of the tunnel. "Maybe it's a combination, Dad," Jack suggested. "Yes," said Charlotte, "like a puzzle." "Well, you have a go, Jack," said Thaddeus. "I was never any good at puzzles." Peggy was standing beside the door when it opened once more. Chowker motioned to his fellow trackers to follow him. "Ansuli!" he called. "Kumba!" Carrying their tools, Whaman and the other trackers hurriedly followed Chowker and Peggy out of the mine towards the rock door entrance. Not far behind, the Silver Skulls were making their way through the tunnel towards the rock door, determined to catch those who had snatched their sacrifice. Jack tried every combination he could think of. Precious seconds were ticking away. All of them could sense that the Silver Skulls were closing in on them. Then, Peggy, Chowker, Whaman, and all the other trackers arrived in the tunnel behind them. "My people!" cried Chowker. "Trackers?" asked Thaddeus. "Not dead," said Chowker, nodding. "They weren't actually sacrificed at all," said Peggy. They were making them work down the mine. "Well, it's great they're alive," said Thaddeus, "but we still have to get out of here." Just then, Jack pulled two levers together. There was a grinding sound and a rumble of rocks as the entrance moved slowly aside. "Everybody out!" shouted Thaddeus. "Move it!" "Umba!" shouted Chowker to the other trackers. Thaddeus stood to one side to let the others through. Then he lifted Laura, still dazed, and carried her outside. Mike, always fascinated with mechanical things, couldn't resist giving the levers one more pull to see if he could figure out the combination. Thaddeus turned round from where he had joined the others outside. "Mike!" he yelled. "Leave it!" An ominous rumble started in the tunnel, and the rocky entrance was starting to close. Mike darted to the opening. "Dad!" he cried out. "I did it! It's moving!" The door was closing fast, grinding and rumbling as it slid over the rocky floor. Thaddeus ran to the opening and grabbed Mike's arm just as the gap had narrowed to a slit. He pulled Mike violently through the entrance in the nick of time, and the rock door thudded shut behind him. Inside, the first Silver Skull had reached the entrance and grabbed at the lever just in time to prevent the rock door from closing. It began to open again. "They're coming!" yelled Thaddeus. He grabbed a pickaxe from one of the trackers and swung it into the stone squares at the side of the entrance. The rock stopped moving, leaving only a small gap. Howls of rage could be heard inside. Thaddeus lifted Laura up and started down the mountain with Charlotte and the others following. Whammon had led the group into a clearing. For the first time, the trackers could enjoy being free again. Smiling and nodding, they started to run down the mountainside back to the home they had been taken from. Thaddeus put Laura carefully on the ground and knelt down in front of her. She was murmuring something as though she had a fever. "Please, I want to go back. Let me go back," she kept saying, and suddenly she went limp in his arms. "Laura!" cried Thaddeus urgently. Everyone gathered round the girl. "Look!" cried Mike suddenly, pointing. On the edge of the clearing stood the bird woman. "Who is she?" asked Charlotte quietly. She had never seen such a strange creature. Her hair was a mass of feathers, falling down her arms to her feathery fingers. "She guided us through the tunnels," whispered Jack. The bird woman raised her arms. Her voice was deep and echoing in Laura's head. "Come back, my child," she called. Laura stirred in her father's arms and opened her eyes. "Dad? Oh, you're safe! You're back!" "And so are you, my love," whispered Thaddeus as he hugged her. Not far behind them, the rock face opened once more, and the Silver Skulls surged through. Thaddeus heard a noise behind him in the forest and turned his head, listening. "What is it?" asked Charlotte. No sooner had she spoken than they saw the Silver Skulls forming a circle around them as they emerged from the forest. As if out of nowhere, they suddenly heard the roar of a helicopter. It surged over the treetops, its blades whirring noisily. The Silver Skulls, terrified by the huge, strange machine, scattered in all directions, vanishing into the forest on either side. Above them, the helicopter hovered for a moment, then started to descend. The children jumped up and down in excitement, calling out and waving their arms around. "Just in the nick of time," breathed Charlotte. Ruby jumped down from the helicopter and ran towards the children. As they fell on her, she hugged them all tightly. There was a bark from inside the helicopter. "Prince!" shouted Laura. "Hey, what's with the war paint?" Ruby asked. "Oh," said Thaddeus, shaking his head wearily and smiling at her. "That's a long story. I have to say that was quite an entrance, Ruby." "I thought you didn't like flying," said Jack. "Oh," said Ruby, "nothing to it." "Chowker," said Charlotte. We haven't had a chance to meet your friend properly yet. This is Ayala, said Chowka. She from my tribe. Thank you from all our people, said Huaman, gravely bowing. Then he turned to Chowka and Ayala. Come, he said, and he turned and left them. We go now, said Chowka, looking at them. Then he took Ayala's hand. We go now, together. Thank you for all you've done for us. Goodbye, said Thaddeus. Bye, they all called, and Chowka and Ayala turned and disappeared into the forest. Thaddeus looked at his children. I'm very proud of you. And there's something I want to say. While Charlie and I were in that cage, waiting to be... what's the word? Said Thaddeus. Barbecued? Offered Peggy. More like steamed, said Mike. Right, Thaddeus grinned. Steamed. I was thinking, I haven't seen enough of you lot. I spend my time wandering off around the world, missing out on the good times. Well, all that's going to change. From now on, I'm staying at home with you and Charlie. Yeah! They shouted. Dad, said Laura quietly. Yes, Laura, said Thaddeus. That woman, that bird, she said, puzzled. The light can play strange tricks in the jungle, Laura. Some things can't easily be explained. Thaddeus put his other arm round Laura, and together they walked towards the helicopter. A DC-3 aircraft flew noisily through the sky. On board, a vicar declared, I now pronounce you man and wife. Thaddeus and Charlotte kissed each other and turned to the children and Ruby. Unusually, the bride and groom were wearing parachutes. Now they walked together to the side of the plane. Charlotte handed her bouquet to Ruby. Bye, darlings, she said. We'll see you soon. Be good now, said Thaddeus. Do as Ruby tells you. Bye, said the children, exchanging grins. Thaddeus and Charlotte stepped out into thin air, and the children and Ruby waved as the happy couple went into free fall for a few meters before their chutes snapped open. Prince barked excitedly. Down on the island, Charlotte and Thaddeus landed on the firm white sand of a beautiful beach, their parachutes collapsing with a sigh around them. They quickly slipped off their harnesses and hugged each other. Alone at last, said Thaddeus, grinning at his new bride. They were just moving closer together, happiness shining in their eyes, when there was a shout from above. Look out! No brakes! It was Mike. Thaddeus and Charlotte looked up at the sky. It was not just Mike, it was all the children parachuting down to the beach. Soon, all of them, grinning from ear to ear, thumped down beside Thaddeus and Charlotte, who were standing speechless on the beach. Above them, they heard something else that sounded very much like a dog barking. Everyone, except Laura, looked amazed as Prince parachuted into view, looking perfectly happy, but a bit windblown. Well, said Laura, I couldn't leave Prince behind, could I? Everyone burst out laughing. Hey, look! Shouted Thaddeus. The aeroplane was making a low pass over the sea in front of them. There was Ruby, giving them a thumbs-up sign from the window. They all had a feeling that this was going to be the best honeymoon ever.